Okay, now we're going to pick up with problem 7. In the review homework, the problem says, find the real solutions of the following equation. So here's the equation. 2x cubed minus 3x squared minus 14x plus 21 Okay, so we're basically trying to solve this. So now there's two possible ways to solve this. This is starting to get a little trickier because you notice here the exponent is a largest exponent's a 3. If it was a 2, it's a quadratic, and we've worked with those a lot, but when exponents start getting to be 3 and above, it can be a little trickier to try and factor and solve. There's really two possible ways to try and factor this and solve it. The first way is, if we have 4 terms, there's a method called factor by grouping, which I'm going to try at first. And if factor by grouping works, that's great, because it's definitely the easier way to factor. If factor by grouping doesn't work, then you have to go through the whole process of rational root theorem and all their possible factors, and then your synthetic division, and it's just a lot more difficult process. So hopefully, we'll cross our fingers, maybe this will work with factor by grouping, and you won't have to go to the long process of rational roots and stuff. So the idea of factor by grouping is when you have 4 terms, and we look at 2 terms at a time and try and factor them separately. Now normally what you do is, normally the first attempt is just to split these up into 2 groups as the equation's written. There may be some times where the way I've broken it up, it doesn't factor, and then you can always move these terms around and regroup them and try again. But we'll see what happens like this. So what I do is I take these first 2 terms, and I'm going to look for a GCF. In this case, there's a GCF of x squared. So I'm going to pull out the GCF, and I end up with 2x minus 3. And then I look at the second 2 terms, and I say, what's the GCF there? And it looks like it's going to be 7. Matter of fact, you never quite know for sure, but I'm going to factor out a negative 7. And then inside the parentheses, I have 2x minus 3. Now, factor by grouping is going to work after this step if we have the same stuff inside the 2 parentheses. Because if we do, then we can go ahead and factor out the whole parenthesis. And then we have this equation itself. So now we've factored it. So now we have 2 factors here, the 2 parentheses. The way we find the solutions is to take each parenthesis and set it equal to 0 and solve for x. So if I take the first parenthesis, I set it equal to 0, I solve for x. So add 3 to both sides, divide both sides by 2. So there's my first solution. Now I take the second parenthesis, and I set it equal to 0, and I solve for this. X squared minus 7, if I add 7 to both sides. If I want to solve for x, I've got an x squared here, but to get from x squared to x, what do? I can take the square root, but of course I have to take the square root of both sides. Now here's one that a lot of us always forget. When we're solving the equation like this, and you take the square root of a number, don't forget It's actually plus or minus square root of 7. So we actually have 3 solutions. Now be careful, because when you enter the answers in the computer, you have to split up the plus and the minus. So in other words, I think on the computer you would enter 3/2, negative square root of 7, and square root of 7. Alright, that problem wasn't too bad, especially because factor by grouping worked. Should have said this was number 7. Alright, let's just continue on. The next problem, number 8. Now number 8 says to graph the polynomial function. So the function is f of x equals x to the 4th plus 12x squared minus 64. Now if I show you the actual test problem, well, let me say this. After they gave you this problem, then they explained the graph. They say the scale for the x-axis is this and this, and the y-axis is this and this. So you have to read about the scaling. But the key thing I want you to realize is, for this problem, it's a multiple choice where you're given 4 graphs. Now this is the kind of problem where when you're taking a multiple choice test problem online, it's very different than if you were in a face-to-face class having to solve this problem. In a face-to-face class, you would actually have to figure things out and actually go in and plot or create the graph. But when it's multiple choice, let me tell you, just to be honest with you, let me tell you oftentimes the easiest way to get the correct answer, and then I will just go ahead, for practice sake, go ahead and sort of officially work out the problem. What I mean by that, here's what I mean. Here's this problem. I have 4 possible answers here. Sometimes what you can do is just use common sense. For example, and you make it easy. For example, what if I just said, well, what happens when x equals 0? In other words, if I said x equal to 0 in this function, f of x or y would have to be negative 64. I can now go look at these graphs and see if I can eliminate some of the graphs. So for instance, if you look at A and you study it closely, actually, so I'm looking for the point 0, negative 64. I can see that A has that. Look at B. When x is 0, y is a positive number. It cannot be B. Look at C. When x is 0, it looks like y is around 0. That can't be correct. Look at D. When x is 0, y is around 0. If you can believe it, just by doing this very simple calculation, I've already determined the answer. And to be honest, when you're taking the test, no one is there filming how you solve the problem, how you do it. Bottom line is, when you're taking a test like this with multiple choice, you're just graded on your answer. Although I will go back and grade, I will give partial credit. But still, a problem like this, if you choose A, you'll get it correct, no matter how you figured that out. So I guess on the test, you know, if I was taking the test, I would probably just do this. Didn't take very long, it's pretty simple. But just for knowledge's sake, let's go ahead and try and figure out what this graph looks like. Let's just say, for example, this graph was given on a paper test and you had to solve it, just so you can understand really the principle behind solving this. And the interesting thing is it's a trinomial, and we've worked with trinomials a lot, but normally the trinomials are quadratic, where you have an x squared and an x and then the number. Here we have an x to the fourth and an x squared and a number. And there's really sort of two ways to go about solving this. One way is, if I had the problem, if they had given me this kind of problem, x squared plus 12x minus 64, that's a normal quadratic. I would just go right away and try and factor it. And when I factored it, I'd have x to the x. And actually, I think when we do this, it ends up being maybe like -4 and positive 16. Now, in a sense, the difference between this quadratic and this equation is, instead of an x squared, I have an x to the fourth, and instead of an x, I have an x squared. But one of the things you learn quickly in a problem like this is I can factor in almost the same way. My factors are going to be the same, except instead of x minus 4 and x plus 16, I'll simply have x squared minus 4 and x squared plus 16. In other words, instead of the variable x here, I have x squared. But if you multiply these two parentheses out, you can see that you'll get this expression. So the idea is, it's a trinomial, and although it's not a quadratic equation, we're going to sort of treat it like a pseudo-quadratic. And we're going to find the factors, but instead of having parentheses with x and x, we have parentheses with x squared and x squared. As a matter of fact, once we do this, we can actually factor some more, because this is a difference of squares. So we really end up with 3 factors. So now, one of the common things you can do is I'm going to set this equal to y. One of the easiest ways to graph is to find x-intercepts. So to find x-intercepts, you basically set y equal to 0 and solve for x. So if I have 0 equals x plus 2, x minus 2, x squared plus 16. I would see my solutions would be -2 from the first parenthesis, 2 from the second parenthesis. How about the third parenthesis? I have to have x squared plus 16 equals 0. X squared equals -16. Take the square root of both sides. And what's interesting is when I look at this, actually this is not a real solution. This would be an imaginary number. So this does not actually give me any x-intercepts. I just have 2 x-intercepts. So basically, and then honestly, if you wanted to, which would be pretty simple at this point, I guess I would just do what I did before. You can plug in a couple points. I guess the question is, would this be an open up or open down parabola? But like I said, if you put in x equals 0, you get -64. So it's like you're way down here. So it's pretty clear. You end up with a graph like this. So actually that kind of problem is actually not very hard to figure out the correct answer. And to be honest, it's not really a great problem for this test because it's hard to do graphing kinds of problems with an online test. So anyway, maybe we'll look at actually the next few problems I'll deal with what we call composite functions. So maybe I'll stop now and then we'll do another video and do a bunch of problems with composite functions.